So, fracture. Charting the complicated relationship and shifting power dynamics among three leaders, Reid shows how the interpersonal politics, along with individual strategies, ambitions, and responses to events such as Ferguson, have influenced decisions and policies, which in turn have shaped and reshaped the Democratic Party. This book traces the Democratic Party's turbulent racial history and the rocky road its candidates and elected presidents have trod on their way to reconciling their party and their country's past with its increasingly diverse future. It also explores how race can affect the crucial 2016 election and the future of America itself. A 2003 Knight Center for Specialized Journalism Fellow, Joy Ann Reid is the host of the Reid Report on weekdays at 2 p.m. on MSNBC. Was the host. She was the host. She is the former managing editor of thegrio.com, a daily online news and opinion platform devoted to delivering stories and perspectives that reflect and affect African American audiences. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Reid served as the Florida Deputy Communications Director for the 527 America Coming Together initiative and was a press aide in the final stretch of President Barack Obama's Florida campaign in 2008. She is currently producing a documentary, The Fight Years, which takes a look into the sport of boxing during the 1950s and 1960s in Miami. So please help me welcome Ms. Joy Ann Reid.
Thank you, Marquise. And thank you all for coming. I just have some friends here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Marquise, also, of course, to Brad and Lissa. It is really great to be here. Now, I've never done anything like this before, this kind of a book talk thing, so please be patient. I'm a little nervous, but I figure if J.K. Rowling can do it, damn it, I can do it too. Also want to say thank you to WHUT and the team who is over there, Maurice, as well as Ebony and future author Rachel, who are over there and did a little interview with me earlier. So we're supporting our young people as they're starting to get into the profession. It's a jungle out there. I'm just letting you know. You're getting into the media, but we support you. Okay, so thank you all for being here. So just really quickly before I read a little bit from the book, I'll just say that the reason that I decided to write this book back in 2013 is when I first pitched it to HarperCollins was I felt that because we have, as a country, have crossed this milestone, this Rubicon of electing the first African-American president, I was interested in the question of what that means for the country and where we sort of are on the issue of race. Does it mean that, racism is over? Does it mean that race is no longer something that we have to discuss or debate? Does it mean that we've put kind of the period or the exclamation point on it? Or does it mean that we still have some complexities to work out? And my conclusion after a year and a half of interviewing lots and lots and lots of people and research and writing and editing and the whole process is that the latter is true, that we still have issues that need to be worked out, some of which were drawn out by the election of Barack Obama. So I'm going to read a little bit. It's only 8 pages. It won't be too long, and then we'll open it up if you guys have comments and questions too. Okay, here we go. Doing my J.K. Rowling without the accent. Here we go. Dating back to the earliest days of the campaign, a dark vein of resistance to Obama's candidacy due to his race arose periodically. There was former Democratic vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro's comment that Obama would never have been in a position to defeat Hillary Clinton had he not been black. Republican Congressman Jeff Davis of Kentucky said, "That boy's finger does not need to be on the button." A California Republican women's group issued gag currency they called Obama Bucks, food stamp send-ups with Obama's head on the body of a donkey surrounded by spare ribs, Kool-Aid, and fried chicken. And Buck Burnett, a University of Texas Longhorns lineman, updated his Facebook status after the election to declare, "All the hunters gather up. We have a nigger in the White House." Michelle Obama, so celebrated in the national press, was subjected to the basest racial distortions. She was depicted in online memes as an unfeminine brute and beast, derided in conservative columns as a dangerous, whitey-hating, America-loathing radical. The term Obama's baby mama was used on Fox News, and the National Review called her Mrs. Grievance. The attacks didn't end with the election, and even I'm missing a page. And even the Obama girls, just 7 and 10 years old when their father took the oath of office, wouldn't be spared. But the new president found himself under a microscope calibrated to detect any hint that he was reacting to the slings and arrows of national politics from the perspective of a black man. The attacks on him and his family had to be borne with a special type of dignity. Every president before him had borne some measure of ridicule, parody, and hatred. The reasoning would go, why not him? Why should attacks on him be especially scrutinized for racist intent? Barack Obama had burst onto the national stage by transcending race and by practicing consistent and convincing racial ecumenism. The onus was on him and his African-American first family to represent America's racial progress and to be the Cosby Show Huxtables in real life. Even Mrs. Obama's mother, Marion Robinson, who in 2009 moved from her Chicago home to the White House to help care for the couple's young daughters, a move not without precedent, from the mother-in-law of President John Tyler to the father-in-law of Benjamin Harrison to multiple family members of Andrew Jackson, was under constant scrutiny. One false policy move, untoward word, or flash of anger would snap the hair trigger of skepticism about whether the real first black president truly did represent all Americans and not just his own people. Any black politician elected outside a safely black district knew the rules for staying racially neutral. They had been around for decades, though this was the first time they were being applied to a president of the United States. 1 month into the nation administration, Eric Holder broke the rules. On February 18, a cartoon in the New York Post lampooned the nearly $1 trillion economic recovery package rejected by Republicans and passed almost entirely by Democrats. The Post cartoon referred to the horrific news story of a Connecticut woman who had been mauled by a pet chimpanzee. In the cartoon, 2 police officers stand over the body of a blood-spattered dead primate. They'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill, the caption read. The cartoon drew immediate outrage as it flew across the internet. Reverend Sharpton issued a statement denouncing it as troubling at best, given the historic racist attacks on African Americans as being synonymous with monkeys. New York Governor David Paterson called on the paper to explain. The Post, owned by conservative mogul Rupert Murdoch, whose international media empire includes Fox News, was a longtime opponent of Democrats, local and national, and had sparred with Sharpton for decades. Its editor vigorously defended the comic as mocking the stimulus package and not the president. But for African Americans, it read as the kind of bestializing that black men and women had been subjected to for centuries, written off as comedy to many on the right, but touching a deep vein of ugly historic memory in black minds and souls. On the day the cartoon ran, Holder was giving his first Black History Month address to the staff at the Justice Department. His speech touched on historic memory, too, and on the inability of black and white Americans to confront it equally. Holder, a former judge and deputy attorney general during the Clinton administration, had joined other Clinton veterans, such as David Wilhelm, Susan Rice, and Patrick Gaspard, in choosing Obama over Hillary in the Democratic primaries. He became a senior legal advisor to the campaign of a man he'd met roughly a year before. Unlike Obama, who proceeded on matters of race with cautious deliberation, Holder, the son of Barbadian parents who raised their 2 boys in the mostly black middle-class suburb of Elmhurst, Queens, had the bearing of an activist. 10 years older than Obama and with a New Yorker's pugnaciousness, he often recounted the time he was stopped by police while sprinting through an upscale neighborhood with a friend trying to make the start of a movie. At the time, he happened to be a federal prosecutor. Holder's Justice Department speech was expansive, touching on the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, integration, affirmative action, and the broad civil rights movement. He spoke of his late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone Jones, one of the 2 black students to face down Governor George Wallace to integrate the University of Alabama in 1963. And he talked about the need to heal communities long scarred by crime and mistrust with police. But Holder began his speech with a damning assessment of the state of interracial dialogue. It landed like a fully armed rocket when it reached the national media. Though this nation has proudly thought of itself as an ethnic melting pot, the Attorney General said, in things racial, we have always been and continue to be in too many ways, essentially a nation of cowards. Holder went on to explain that unresolved issues of race remain front and center in America's politics and culture, though we, average Americans, simply do not talk enough with each other about race. It is an issue we have never been at ease with, and given our nation's history, this is in some ways understandable. And yet, if we are to make progress in this area, we must feel comfortable enough with one another and tolerant enough of each other to have frank conversations about the racial matters that continue to divide us. Within hours, conservative blogs were denouncing Holder and trying to use his presence as the Attorney General and Obama's as president, and even Martin Luther King Day, as proof that the nation had paid its racial debts. But these were some of the same voices insisting that a monkey cartoon lampooning the first black president was just a monkey cartoon. The White House was caught off guard by the outcry over Holder's speech. The new administration had no intention of wading into racial conflict, preferring to keep the president focused on the needs of all Americans and principally on the economy. Anything that racialized the Obama presidency was unwelcome in the West Wing. Asked about Holder's comments by New York Times reporter Helene Cooper in early March, Obama said that had he been advising his attorney general, we would have used different language. Obama concurred with the underlying point of Holder's speech, saying, we're oftentimes uncomfortable with talking about race until there's some sort of racial flare-up or conflict. And as a country, we could probably be more constructive in facing up to sort of the painful legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination. But Obama was quick to pivot to a focus on the nation's progress. I'm not somebody who believes that constantly talking about race somehow solves racial problems, he said. I think what solves racial tension is fixing the economy, putting people to work, making sure that people have health care, ensuring that every kid is learning out there. I think if we do that, then we'll probably have more fruitful conversations. Whatever the president's annoyance over the bluntness of the attorney general's words, Holder had exposed a truth that to black Americans seemed both obvious and their countrymen too often ease their discomfort over racial disparities by ignoring the subject of race altogether, except on those occasions when it sputters and spills out in ugly emails and Facebook posts, gag food stamps with Barack Obama's picture on them, ugly rally signs, and unfortunate newspaper cartoons. His speech earned him widespread acclaim among African Americans who quickly took notice of the Attorney General. And Holder had strong supporters inside the White House, including Gaspard and Jarrett and the president himself. He had no intention of walking his comments back. On the contrary, Holder would continue to be a lightning rod. From the start, the new Attorney General had stated his determination to revive the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, which had become moribund and dispirited under the previous administration. There have been large numbers of resignations as pressure mounted to pursue mythic voter fraud and what many longtime division lawyers viewed as politicized partisan cases. Holder put an end to that quest in a bid to revive what he saw as the department's original mission, safeguarding voters from impediments to access to the polls, vigorously responding to alleged violations of the Voting Rights Act as the country headed toward a new census and a fresh round of federal and state gerrymandering. An admirer of Nicholas Katzenbach, Robert Kennedy's successor, who was Attorney General, brought federal troops to Alabama and personally faced down Governor Wallace to break the infamous stand at the schoolhouse door. Holder saw his role as grounded in Katzenbach's example, protecting vulnerable citizens from the caprice of state power by bringing federal authorities to bear. Holder had his critics on the left who thought he and the president did not vigorously pursue the titans of Wall Street who had brought about the collapse of the economy. They also blamed him for not surmounting congressional opposition to the closing of the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay and for his failure to secure federal prosecution for accused terrorists imprisoned there. Those criticisms were a source of deep frustration for Holder, who determined early on that there were no strong cases to bring against Wall Street bankers. But for civil rights leaders, he was an immediate friend. By the summer of 2009, Democrats had claimed their 60-vote majority in the Senate after resolving the seat in Minnesota, where a lawsuit by his opponent forced Al Franken to wait until July 7th to take his seat. And once Biden and Obama's seats in Delaware and Illinois were filled, the latter ending in the indictment of the state's governor. However, Republicans had honed their strategy of total obstruction, calling upon the same device segregationist Democrats once used in order to stall civil rights legislation, the filibuster. It was in those months that the health care bill, an Obama priority since the campaign, was making its way slowly, painfully, and publicly through the Senate. The president's opponents soon had the perfect vehicle to exploit the tortured process for political gain. The day after Holder's Nation of Cowards speech, a former hedge fund manager and commodities trader from Chicago, Rick Santelli, launched into an extended rant on CNBC, denouncing what he saw as Obama's mortgage bailout, in which the financial industry would be forced to write down the amounts due on mortgages that had ballooned far beyond the value of the homes they were tied to. The policy, called cram down, had been a key request of the administration from progressive and civil rights groups. The big banks, not surprisingly, were vehemently opposed. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise your hand, Santelli raged, vilifying deadbeat homeowners. President Obama, are you listening? The rant went viral, punctuated by Santelli's call for a July 4th Chicago Tea Party. The swelling opposition from the right to everything the president was doing, from financial reform to health care, now had a name. And while the origins of the Tea Party movement had roots in Chicago's libertarian movement dating back to 2002, Santelli popularized it and aimed the laser straight at Obama. Coincidentally, the president's chief economic advisors, Timothy Geithner and Larry Summers, were counseling the White House away from the actions the financial industry was so up in arms about. And as a result, the president was getting heat from the left because he seemed to avoid progressive solutions to the housing crisis. Liberals were learning that they may have underestimated the extent to which Obama's pragmatism outweighed his idealism. As the White House and Democrats in Congress moved toward passage of the health care bill, the road got increasingly ugly as town hall meetings turned raucous. Tea Party protesters claimed the president was secretly planning death panels to discard the elderly and disabled, cried socialism, and carried homemade signs comparing Obama with African witch doctors and Adolf Hitler. And in the midst of it all, the president followed Holder into the thicket of racial outrage. On July 16, a Cambridge, Massachusetts police officer arrested Henry Louis Gates, an Obama friend and the head of Harvard's Department of African American Studies. Gates had accidentally locked himself out of his home and was attempting to gain entry when a neighbor called 911 to report a possible break-in. Gates became angry when Sergeant James Crowley didn't believe he lived in the home and removed him from his porch in handcuffs. And though the Cambridge Police Department later dropped disorderly conduct charges against the professor, the officer refused to apologize, saying he had followed proper procedures. The local police union stood firmly behind Crowley, even as Gates threatened to sue. At a July 22nd primetime press conference, Obama responded to a question about the incident. Now, I don't know, not having been there, not seeing all the facts, what role race played, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would have been pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there's a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. That's just a fact. President Obama was speaking off the cuff and as Gates' friend, but he had broken the rules of comportment, particularly for a man who had billed himself as a practitioner of racial healing, not racial confrontation. His comments set off an immediate firestorm. Conservative commentators accused the president of race baiting and of an outrageous attack on law enforcement. For the first time in his political career, Barack Obama was discovering what it was like to be Al Sharpton. The speed and vehemence of the uproar shocked the White House. They had come to Washington prepared to fight on the familiar ground of spending and taxation and to engage in the battles that were necessary to pass health care reform. But Obama had not intended to light any bonfires on race as president. In an attempt at healing, a summit was hastily arranged for the next week, in which Crowley and Gates would sit for a photo opportunity in the Rose Garden with the president and Vice President Biden, who during the fall campaign served as a key validator for Obama with white blue-collar voters. The goal of this beer summit, as it came to be known, was to create a patina of national healing. The teachable moment was punctuated by exhortations about disagreeing without being disagreeable. As political theater, it was pure Barack Obama, the very picture of Midwestern moderation and probity. But the damage was already done. A Pew poll taken 5 days after the press conference showed that Obama's approval rating among white Americans had slipped from 53% to 46%. while the approval of non-white and or Hispanic Americans climbed 11 points from 63 to 74%. African Americans thought Obama had spoken truth to a power many found onerous and omnipresent, the police. He'd also exposed the reality of racial profiling, even of a man who'd done everything right, becoming educated and successful and affluent. And Obama had done the exposing from the pulpit of the presidency, which gave his exhortations a power they had never known. It was cathartic, particularly coming from a man who up to this point had been so measured in his public pronouncements on race. The Pew poll also found that white Americans blamed Gates more than Crowley for the incident by 7 percentage points and overwhelmingly disapproved of the president's handling of the incident by a margin of 2-1. Of those white Americans who heard a lot about the incident, the level of disapproval was 70% versus 23% approval. And it was just 6 months into his presidency, and Obama's racial honeymoon was over. His opponents on the right felt this proved that Obama was no racial healer. He was just another race-hustling divider who never had any intention of being everybody's president. The White House team absorbed a lesson that Bill Clinton had learned a generation earlier with the uproar over his apologies during his African trip. For even a post-racial president, touching the electrified rail of race bears exquisite peril. It was a lesson that would reverberate within the administration for years to come. That is all I'm going to read. Oh, stay up here? Okay, so I'll stay up here. And the reason I chose that passage, it isn't all about the Democrats. And the book really does deal a lot with some of the fissures on the Democratic side. But you can't write about race in the Obama administration without, of course, writing about the opposition, which definitely came in to the Obama era with a plan that had to do with making him a one-term president, making him an asterisk, and making sure that he couldn't succeed. And while that was not all explicitly racial, some of the specific attacks on him became really racial really quickly. And I did that timeline to show just how really quickly it was. We're talking about a 6-month period in which Eric Holder already had drawn the ire of people within months of Barack Obama taking office, and then he himself followed. So I think that race has provided an undercurrent and a context to the Obama presidency that even he didn't want, but that he was stuck with and that we're stuck with as a country. So I think it's something we can't escape, neither the Democratic or the Republican Party can. And, we can talk about the Black Lives Matter, Bernie Sanders moment or any number of reasons why we are still not post-racial. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Be brave.
There are mics on either side of the pillars here. You can file up and...
Hello. You're tall, so you might need to...
Yeah. Well, I'm supposed to always start out by saying I'm not an American. I'm from the Caribbean. So, so I want to be very careful about what I'm saying about this issue. But I have a little bit of background in the whole Obama election. I was at, I'm not going to call the name of the university. I was at the university at that point in time doing my PhD in political science. And when he was elected, basically, all the white professors were completely enamored with the process, right? And it caused me to ask myself some questions, right? What was going on here? I mean, you guys should be a little bit more sophisticated to believe that this puts an end to racism and discrimination. So, but they were absolutely convinced that it basically was done, right? Time to move on, shut up, and just move on, right? Being a Caribbean person, it's not really my main focus, but it's still my focus as part of the African diaspora. So let me ask you a question, because I'm very ambivalent about Obama, to be honest with you. Now, I hope this is never sent out in the Caribbean, and because my mother would be my mother would be extremely enraged with what I'm going to say now. Right? I really don't see much in Obama at all. When he was running, I told people, I saw African Americans totally in love with him. I said, this is going to be a big joke. He's going to be a big joke for you guys, and he's going to be, in my opinion, a very dangerous joke for you. Obama is useful as the white power structure has delegitimized itself to cover up a period of illegitimacy of the white power structure. But beyond that, I don't think you're going to get much out of him. I think I'm practically 100% correct in that. I may be wrong, but I think I'm quite correct in it. So I want to ask you something. I think there's a lot of love in the black community for Obama. I mean, symbolic love and stuff like that. There can't be underestimated. My mother, right, is very much part of that. Don't you believe, and again, it's a complex issue, the Democratic Party and race. I mean, historically, right? Right? We don't want to talk about that. Starting on the FDR, you got this kind of slow movement towards different things.
Okay, we're getting to the question. The question's coming. I feel it in my heart.
The question now is, don't you believe the role that Obama has played vis-a-vis the question of race and class, right? That has created tremendous problems for African Americans potentially moving forward, right? If you don't want to put pressure on him, when a white president's come in and blacks go to him and say you got to do something,
right.
And said do something to Obama.
Okay. Well, I mean, that. Yeah, no, I think that Barack Obama's election exposed things that were already there. I don't think that his being elected caused racial conflict so much as it exposed underlying racial conflict. And I always feel that when you talk about race, you have to understand that as far as I have been able to determine in my years of life, you see how I played that, Marquise? You see, you learn when you get to my age, you're gonna do it too. Is that I think white and black Americans just have very different expectations when it comes to racial discussion, and had very different expectations. And we're just now talking about Democrats and the few liberal Republicans left, the ones who voted for Barack Obama, was that I think that for a lot of white America, Barack Obama's election was about, if not eliminating racial conflict, it was about healing the past racial conflict and demonstrating the progress of the country and bringing the country together and sort of bringing that to a close. Whereas for African Americans, it wasn't about eliminating that conversation. It was about illuminating that conversation. And I think that because black people live in race all the time, whether you're walking through a store or whether the police are pulling up behind you and you're getting a knot in your stomach, whatever you're doing, you're living your race all the time. Whereas for white Americans, you may live your ethnicity sometimes. Like if you're Irish American, there's like a moment where you're like, yeah, Irish American. It's that holiday that's about you, but you don't live race all the time. And so I think that you just have very different expectations, and neither is wrong. They're just different. And so I think that when African Americans discuss the past, it's cathartic for African Americans and can feel accusatory for white Americans. And Barack Obama was kind of perfectly positioned to be the first black president because he truly understands both sides of that dynamic, having been raised in a very white context by a white Midwestern family in Hawaii. But at the same time, living in black skin has its own set of realities. And so he lived blackness as a human being, but he grew up really understanding and being steeped in what white America feels and deals with and understands. And so that's why he could give that Philadelphia speech and have both white and black Americans go, oh my God, this guy really gets us. Because he does. He really does. And that's a special thing. And I think that only someone like him could have been president of the United States. And when I talk about the rules, what I mean is that black politics has a certain meaning in this country, and it's a limiting meaning, meaning that if you have a majority black district, you can talk race, you can do race talk all the time because your constituents have needs that they understand are race based, and so that's what you do. That limits your rise. You can't become Cory Booker or Barack Obama or a statewide candidate hardly even and talk explicitly about race. It makes it very difficult. Think Jesse Jackson, right? He can't be president because he was doing very specific, not just race talk, but poverty talk, LGBT talk before it was something that was mainstream. So it limits you. And I think he was not limited in that way. I don't know if that answered your question. Was there this? Yes.
Yes. So I agree with you that from day one, Barack Obama was just subjected to this incredible obstructionism by the Republicans. And it's just become ingrained in our politics. I mean, clearly there's a racial underpinning to all of that. But to what extent do you think that's become part of the new politics? And do you think that a first woman president would have a similar kind of backlash? Or do you think it would be ameliorated if there is a white man who gets elected next?
Yeah. Oh, I think no matter which, first of all, I think that I thought at the time, my husband is here somewhere. There's my husband. Hey, husband. At the time that the primaries were going on, I was doing radio at the time, and Jason, my husband, and I used to have this conversation, and I think we both agreed that whichever Democrat got the nomination was going to be president. There was just so much going on post-Bush administration, so much, disappointment. The economy was falling off a cliff. So either one that got the nomination was going to win, in my opinion. And I think had it been Hillary Clinton, we would now be into our 6th year of vehement anti-woman rhetoric and sexism and all of the detritus from Clinton hatred and Clinton paranoia. And it would have been ugly just in a different way. And I think if Hillary Clinton becomes president, it will be ugly in that way. I think that women have had a fight of their own that's unique. And I think that African Americans have had one that's unique. I just think that we're a country that still has stuff to work out. The first gay president is going to have stuff, right? We have issues, right? So the first Latino president, God forbid, Donald Trump, if he's even in the country, is going to make that person's life hell. He's going to make that person's life a living hell. So we have issues, but we have issues because we're the only truly multiracial democracy. If you go, where my husband's from is from England. If you go to Europe still is like a salad bowl, not a melting pot. You can come from the Middle East and have been fourth generation Moroccan, but you're still a tomato. You're never a part of the salad. You're a tomato, and your kid's a tomato, and you never get mixed into the soup or into the, for my analogy to work, everybody has to be a vegetable. But Europe is just different. They don't let you be French. You can't be French. You're a Moroccan forever. You're never French, right? Whereas American, you can come in from wherever, and you can just be American. You can be Bobby Jindal and be like, Indians? Who? I don't even know who they are. I never heard of them. What do they eat? What are they like? I don't know them. And you can submerge yourself in an American identity. We're the only country that can do that. But that comes with baggage, especially when the way that one particular group got in the soup, got into the melting pot, was through slavery, something we don't talk about. Most Americans don't really truly know the depth and detail of, right? We were talking about that earlier today, that if you really can't confront the horror of what we did as a country to start this country, and the horror that underpinned everything, all of our economy, the shipping economy in the North was tied to it, not just the cotton economy of the South, all of it, Wall Street, everything. We just built our country on that. And then when we finally freed the slaves, we kept importing more poor people to do the work. So you have waves and waves of immigration all tied to economics. So we just have issues we haven't worked out. So I don't even remember what question I'm answering, but anyway.
Thank you kindly. I have a question regarding a moment that happened in the primary in a conflict between Hillary and Obama. In May of 2008, Hillary made an allusion to the assassination of Robert Kennedy several times. And I was a strong Hillary supporter and Bill Clinton supporter pretty much my whole life up until that point. I was wondering, are there some conflicts in the world of race that you sort of cannot come back from? And now that we're in a time when Hillary will most probably get the Democratic nomination, how do we address that comment, which to me was a devastating comment? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask one more question, mm-hmm. but you only have to answer one of the two. Or you don't have to. You can answer whatever you'd like to. Mm-hmm. In the first midterm election, it was pretty clear that the Congressional Black Caucus did not know what to do with Obama. At the time, he was really focused on his health care plan, but the country really needed jobs. And I was of the opinion at that point that really what the black community needed was its own think tank, a place where we could work out our ideas, understanding that we're not black politicians, but in the context of the broader community. And I was wondering your opinion on that as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good questions. Okay, so really, I'll try to be brief now. The first one, I think what happened with the Clintons is that you had in Bill Clinton in particular, almost a feeling of personal ownership of the Kennedy legacy. Bill Clinton revered John F. Kennedy and wanted so badly to be draped in the mantle of JFK that when the media began really alluding to Barack Obama as almost a young Jack Kennedy, when the Kennedy family drifted toward Obama and not toward Hillary, I think that in addition to Barack Obama blindsiding them by running, they didn't think he was going to run, and then blindsiding them by succeeding against her and sort of taking away what they thought was hers and her turn and her time. But I think the Kennedy thing struck a particular chord in the Clintons because they were so married to that legacy, that those comments were unthinking and thoughtless. I don't think they were intended to be racial. I don't think they saw themselves as saying things that were racial, but I think what they said was received racially by African Americans, because again, the two different ways that we talk about race. And so there are just certain third rails that she touched and he touched. And by the way, another thing that I go through in the book is the fact that a lot of those comments that were made in New Hampshire were made after Barack Obama shocked them by winning in Iowa, and truly for the first time jeopardized her hold on what she thought was her nomination. And they were made in one day. They were all made in one grueling day when the Clintons were campaigning from early morning, when one of her supporters introduced her with a comment about JFK being assassinated and was sort of rebuked and spanked by the press. But you remember one of her supporters got on stage and introduced her with something like that, and then she was commenting on it. And then they just kept making mistake after mistake as they got more and more exhausted, and I think more and more sort of desperate. So I think they made all these mistakes, and then they just rippled through South Carolina, and it got away from them. And so I think that I don't think they meant those comments racially, but I think they definitely said them in desperation, and I'm quite sure if they could go back, they would not say any of them because they didn't land very well. Even the ones that were factually accurate, like about the taking a president to sign legislation, but it just seemed dismissive and saying Obama is MLK. No, he's not running to be MLK. He's running to be Lyndon Johnson, right? You can't say that you're Lyndon Johnson and he's MLK. You're taking him out of context. So that's the first one. On the second one, I think the Congressional Black Caucus, and definitely in the research for the book, this came through very loud and clear. The CBC didn't really know what to do with Obama because and it was partly because they come from what I talked about earlier, black politics. Black politics is a very specific thing. You're you're on the south side of Chicago, or if you're Maxine Waters, you're in, the heavily black district in LA, although she has a lot of white constituents too, but you're able to say to them very specifically, I understand the police are doing X, Y, and Z. We're going to do something about that. I understand you have economic needs. We're going to try to get some money to this program and that. And it's very specific. He wasn't doing that, and he wasn't going to do it. And no matter how they tried, they couldn't get him to do race-based solutions. And at the same time, if they hit him too hard, they felt they were emboldening and empowering his worst opponents, the people who were carrying Hitler signs and witch doctor signs, and the people who were totally obstructing him on the other side. They didn't want to empower them. So they were kind of caught where they couldn't do what, for instance, the Dreamers have done, which is to go after Democrats and hit them and hit them and hit them until they get what they want. And they couldn't do what the LGBT community did, which was literally to threaten to defund the Obama project in the first year and a half that it existed if they didn't do specific things on Don't Ask, Don't Tell and DOMA. That, the Obama administration was like, why is the left coming after us? Well, that's how you get stuff. That's how you win. And black people haven't been able to do that for a whole bunch of psychological and weird reasons. And so I think the lesson is, if these other groups are using the tactics that black civil rights leaders honed and perfected, you might want to use them too. And Black Lives Matter, I think, is the first time that you're seeing a majority black entity in the civil rights vein really go after Democrats and go after liberals and go after the administration. And you know what? That works. That's how you get stuff. This
Hi. Oh, can you all hear me? Hello. Hi. You kind of actually gave a segue into one of the questions I was going to ask. It's Black Lives Matter related. But first, I would like to say thank you for actually, first of all, writing this book.
Thank you.
And highlighting it. And I really appreciate from the passage, the nuance and attention that you put to the difference in age and generation between Holder and Obama, and also how they were socialized, how Eric Holder came from a majority black environment, and how Barack Obama was raised interracially, et cetera. Because I think that plays into the context as you clearly outlined, into their leadership styles and how they relate policy-wise to those things. Which brings into my question. And about the continuation of the Black freedom movements, which I believe that Black Lives Matter is a continuation of the same freedom movement that we've been on for a very long time, and how we as young Black millennials who represent this, whether or not I'm officially a part of Black Lives Matter or not, I'm a young Black millennial in this country, and this is my movement, and I want to know how better we can move forward in owning that collective political agency to aggressively agitate and speak to power but also have that tangible change handy.
Right.
Like what you gave examples from how the LGBT movement worked, and I'm, as an LGBT individual, I'm familiar with, how large bodies like the HRC have funding, etc., to be able to say, look, we've got this millions of dollars, we have this collective bargaining here,
right?
We're not going to back you, right? But when you have a consortium of young, debt-laden postgraduate,
right.
want to be continued graduate
right.
persons, that type of money talks, right? And so when you don't have you're easily dismissed, and so all you have is your physical body and your agitation and your gumption to speak loudly truth to power in ways that aren't politically acceptable. But the expound upon that, because you talked about that in your thing, in your book. I mean, how do we? We're a generation that likes to speak truth to power, right? We don't have the same political nuances that the larger, older generation has, like the old black politic. The younger generation, we don't really care for that.
Right.
We like to be blunt and frank and call a thing.
Right.
Call racism, call white privilege. We say those words actively. And so how do we bridge that gap and integrate into the system?
Yep.
Yes.
That's a great question. So here's the thing. I am really fascinated by Black Lives Matter, because I'm glad that you called it a continuation of there's been a freedom movement. There's been a Black liberation movement, or whatever you want to call it specifically, for a long time. And what's really fascinating is that it's almost always been galvanized around the issue of policing. If you go back and look at the vast majority of the riots that took place in the 1960s, they were sparked by a police officer kills person X. There's a belief there won't be any justice for it. Riot. It's as Martin Luther King said, it's the language of the unheard. It's despair over policing has produced a lot of the problems we've had, mixed in with economic want. Those things they're around for a long time. And we should also understand that on the issue of politeness and movements, Dr. King was not considered some great racial healer. He was demonized across the country as a racial provocateur who was only looked to as the preferred leader of the party because of the existence of alternatives like Malcolm X, right? Where they're like, we don't like you, but we like you better than him. So we're going to go with you, even though we don't like you. I'd cite some polls, Gallup polls from the 1960s in which George Wallace has far higher approval ratings than Martin Luther King Jr. That's just reality. So I think that for the Black Lives Matter movement, understanding that it's not a new thing, that confrontation within the Democratic space and in the liberal space is not a new thing. SNCC, which was in a lot of the same position as Black Lives Matter, they were the young kids who were dependent on SCLC and the Kingian movement for money. They were constantly, I don't know how many letters I read in doing the research for the book, letters of SNCC having to write to Dr. King and write to his movement for funding because they didn't have any money. They were 20-somethings. They were very radical. John Lewis is an urbane congressman now, but he went to the March on Washington to tell off John F. Kennedy. He didn't go there to support the Democrats. He went there to literally dress down the president of the United States and say that he had failed Black America and was letting people die. That's what he wanted to say. And it took the older members of the movement, the labor union members, and some religious leaders who said, we'll pull out if you don't make him change it. So you had King making him change the speech. So you had a lot of times this sort of issue of young, more brash movements that are more in your face and want direct action bump up against not just the party they prefer, but also they bump up against older, sort of more urbane parts of the movement. So I think for Black Lives Matter, number one, every single person that calls himself Black Lives Matter should be registered to vote. Because you can't have a movement that doesn't have access to the mechanism, the only real mechanism for power, right, which is elections. So and right now, someone pointed out to me recently, there is not a single national voter registration movement taking place on the left. I think probably Republicans are, but there's not. This is the first time. So go back really quickly to Jesse Jackson when he was a much younger man, when he was about in his early 40s. The two presidential campaigns he ran were movements. They were never expected to necessarily get the White House, but these were movements. These were voter registration drives that swept across the South. This man won 13 states, not because he was doing traditional politics. He was doing a movement. And it physically changed the Democratic Party by changing its demographics. You have to make voting and voter registration a part of any movement, and you have to encourage people to take the power and the passion and go to the polls with it, because otherwise you're just, you can't. Oh, and you have to. that didn't go anywhere. They said vote or die. Nobody voted. But yeah, people didn't vote. And then the last thing I'll say, I mean, Diddy, he had the shirts and people bought the shirts, but people didn't necessarily do it, right? And the Obama campaign had that feeling of a movement, and people galvanized by it because it felt like a movement. Of course, later people felt disappointed because they thought more, that miracles would happen. But so you have to be realistic, know that miracles don't happen. Politics is slow and painful and horrible. But you'd have to register to vote, and you have to ignore the calls for politeness, because movements don't have to be polite in order to be successful. They have to be persistent, and they have to be consistent, and they have to not get tired of being told no until they get told yes. It works for almost everyone. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Best of luck. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I'm a longtime fan.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to word this clearly, but how do you see the role of the media in moving the race discussion forward, and kind of in self-policing, and how the coverage, especially like with the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, you see the difference of coverage of white people finding food versus black people looting.
Yeah.